Bonsoir. So, welcome to another UBC PPE Course Conversation. My name is Renaud-Philippe Garner. I'm an assistant professor here at UBCO, and today my guest is once again Azar Gat, professor of political science at Tel Aviv University and the Ezer Weitzman Chair for National Security. So, Azar, Boker Tov.
Okay, Tom. Good morning.
So, students listened to the video. We talked about it a bit in class, and some of them have managed to formulate coherent and intelligible questions. And so let's try to discuss some of these questions. But before we get there, maybe we can just finish off the kind of unfinished business of explaining the decline in war, at least amongst the developed nations, and perhaps the threats of return or those conditions falling apart.
So I'm not sure what I already talked about it. It's slipped my memory. But in any case, the underlying trend that explains the decline of war is the escape from the Malthusian trap. Did I talk about this?
I don't think
Uh,
we've gone into too much detail about it.
so that's the point. The pre-modern world was dominated by the logic described by Thomas Malthus in his book in 1799, where he explained that every increase in production is absorbed by growing population because there is more food, so more women are getting pregnant, the more children survive to adulthood, and so there is a population increase. So any increase in production is absorbed. This is the tragedy of the pre-modern world, which, as a result, always lived on the verge of starvation and could easily slip below it. And if this is the situation, then any increase, if one wants to increase its share of a finite wealth, the only way to do it is by taking from others. Whether these others are your inferiors within society, or if these others are foreigners, foreign countries. It's a zero-sum game if wealth is static and finite. And therefore, violence was one of the main means of achieving it, almost a predominant means of, accumulating huge wealth. All these changes with the Industrial Revolution, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the countries the societies that have gone through the revolution, and not all of them have so far, wealth has increased by a factor of between 35 and 50. That is the wealthiest countries in 1800, such as Britain, the United States, in wealth per capita, Britain, the United States, Holland, all of them are about as rich as the poor countries in today's world. So wealth has increased exponentially in all these countries. It has increased as a result of economic growth at home, from which military spending is now regarded rightly as a distraction from the resources invested in the economy. So this changes the whole thing. The pie is now growing, and it's growing because of, as I said, the domestic investment in the economy. Everybody is benefiting. So the entire balance between peace and war has changed. It's not that war has become more costly, as many people believe, but it's peace that has become that much more profitable. And even though people may not be able to formulate everything that I've said in terms of theory, they feel it. They understand that they have very little to profit from a war, a lot to lose, and so they vote accordingly, or they choose accordingly. And this is the change. And this change has been responsible for the marked decline of war during the famously peaceful 19th century between 1815 and 1914, and the same for the long peace after 1845. Now, regarding the challenges to this peace, so we see, first of all, that the countries, I think we talked about this. So the countries of the developed world are a zone of peace. We talked about this. The countries that have not gone through the revolution are still a zone of war, in the sense that Hobbes ascribed to this concept. That is, that war is always to be expected there, even if it's not actually occurring. Now, this peace is vulnerable, not so much in the developed parts of the world. I don't see war occurring in any part of the developed world. That is, I repeat, with countries where societies where production per capita is higher than $20,000. There are two main challenges. One is the unconventional terrorism. This is something to look forward to in the 21st century. And the other thing is obviously these far developing, but still far less developed countries such as China and Russia. Superpowers by virtue of their huge size, economic growth, and nuclear arsenal. All of them have great incentives to keep the peace, especially China, much more than Russia. Russia is not a productive economy. It lives off rent, mainly through the export of energy. But China has a lot to profit from the continuation of peace. It's nationalist saber rattling, and perhaps in the future, and then threats of war, and perhaps war in the future, and them are working against this prospect. China sees Taiwan as a vital national interest. There is little that one can do against this. Same, it's for its possession over the South China Sea. In my judgment, this is going to end in tragedy for China. But unfortunately, as with Germany during the first half of the 20th century, any tragedy for China cannot but become a tragedy for the rest of the world.
Great. So in a way, what we get is a very sober picture, right? So this is very different from someone like Pinker, who basically thinks that we're better people than our ancestors in a way. And what you're basically saying is, look, certain material conditions have to obtain. And once those material conditions obtain, the incentives shift. War used to be a way of getting around problems with resources. Today, wealth is produced better in peacetime than in wartime. So we have very little reason to go to war. But that wealth isn't equally distributed across the world. And so for those who haven't reached that level of wealth, they don't have necessarily the same incentives about maintaining peace or going to war. So I suppose in a way it relates to maybe a bigger, broader debate, not just about war between nations, but also about sometimes general human behavior, or what that we might call moral or admirable. Some people think that, well, because we've become better, we get more rich. And it seems like the general pattern is actually, no, it's first you get richer and you improve people's conditions, and then you can expect better behavior. So the more fundamental shift seems to be more about improving people's material conditions not just giving them more sermons. There's a fight about that, I think, in economics about things like labor rights or things like that. Is it first the economy grew and then we could treat the workers better, or because the workers protested that eventually they got better rights? So it seems like it's a very sober picture based on pretty identifiable conditions. And just quickly, you were talking about China, on the one hand, having strong economic incentives to keep the peace, but also being torn by this nationalistic agenda. And I seem to recall, perhaps that we've discussed this in the past, that in your view, this is a trade-off that happens at the lower end of the economic. So when a country is rich or getting richer, but not quite amongst the richest, that there is still this tug of war between these, call them symbolic or more moral claims about what you should do and what cost you'll incur. And so as you transition into these richer tiers, you're kind of still threatened by this idea of being pulled back into this older logic in a way. Is that right?
So, for example, consider Europe in the 19th century. Europe was, in a way, in the same place that China is today in terms of industrialization and everything connected with it, because industrialization is much more than just a sweeping change in itself, but not just a huge increase in productivity, but it's also about moving to the city, about higher levels of not only affluence, but education, everything connected with this. So Europe was pretty much there during the 19th century and still found itself in World War I and then also in World War II, when the nationalistic idea took over, first in the form of wars for national liberation, such as the German Wars of Unification in the 1860s, which separated the first and the second long periods of peace. And then with the colonial ways, which suggested that the global economy might become closed rather than open, and in my view was the main incentive for World War I. The tensions that this race has this race injected into the international system ultimately exploded in World War I. So pretty much the same tensions that we saw in Europe and the West during the 19th century, we see now with China. In the West, so for example, the nationalist tensions have decreased a great deal, not partly because of the recognition of secession as an option if certain conditions are met. So you are speaking from Canada, so we know that the Quebecois, if they decide on this, there is this general agreement that no, if they so decide, they may be allowed to opt out. And the same applies in Britain to Scotland. The same applies to Belgium. If they decide to break up, and they would have decided so had they been able to decide what to do with Brussels. So the legitimacy of this option and other relaxation of the nationalist motive help to remove the option of, say, active civil war or foreign war
Mhm.
in rights to minorities, autonomies. All this is much more allowed, recognized in the affluent West. So the kind of tensions that exploded in 19th century Europe is what we see now in much less tolerant societies, above all China.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm very glad that we have this presentation of this trend, and I hope that the students will be able to think about this and maybe also think about perhaps the fragility of this trend. It's not faded by any sort of march that can't be.
It's
Um,
fragile, obviously, but I must return that I don't see war occurring anywhere within the developed world. It's
mhm.
the huge stretch of the imagination to see, wars taking place today in any part of the developed world.
No, I certainly agree with you. I would not bet any money on the Netherlands invading Ireland anytime soon. I
Or
certainly agree.
Germany invading, or Germany invading the Netherlands. Let's be more,
Sure,
closer
sure.
to historical experience.
And yes, certainly the case. So let's move to some questions that students have written. So one student, having read your Machiavelli article, this is perhaps my fault. I mentioned it in class in the Machiavelli course. Wanted to ask, how frequent was it? How common was it for leaders, military thinkers, or military leaders to really dismiss innovation or kind of fail to understand something that's going to be transformative? And could this be described as a kind of general pattern of skepticism? The army doesn't get innovation, or is this really more of a case by case, leader by leader? There is no real clear pattern.
So after Machiavelli, as the notion progress, development, evolution has taken place. We can already see it. I don't remember if I mentioned it. You can already see it in Francis Bacon in the first half of the 17th century, who said that three innovations have transformed the world far beyond what the ancients had known, which was, like blasphemy at the time. The three were gunpowder and the printing press and ocean navigation.
Mhm,
And he was right, of course. And this started this debate in parallel. There was the beginning of that debate in France of the 17th century, who was more advanced, the ancients or the moderns, which again was something that, as unprecedented, because nobody during the Renaissance ever doubted that the ancients were that much more, were the pinnacle of human achievement. And then
mhm,
the 18th century, there was no question at all, following the scientific revolution and everything. And then again, with the industrial revolution of the 19th century, people became accustomed, more accustomed
mhm,
to technological change as as a major aspect of human life, affecting everything, including the military.
mhm,
Uh, Obviously, there have always been uh, traditionalist adherence to the old ways, with which they were more familiar, and all this. But I think that the main thing is not this. The main thing is, or has been since the beginning of the 19th century, has been to identify how exactly the technological change was going to change war. Not only war. So let's take an example. During the past generation, there have been thousands of high-tech companies arising, right?
mhm,
But only Apple and what's his name and Google and, and Facebook and all only they got it right. or I mean,
Mm.
got it right in the big time. So the question is, the devil here is in the details. So take, for example, the interwar period between World War I and World War II. They were experiencing the huge effects of mechanization, both in land warfare and in air warfare.
Mhm.
Now, they were all very well aware that this was a very radical change that was going to transform war. But the question of how exactly, what shape exactly the changes should take was very far from clear. So should air forces, for example, focus on strategic bombing? Or should they focus on cooperation with land armies? What is the right ratio between fighter aircraft and bombers? Will the bombers always get through, as the British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin said in Parliament in the mid-30s, or can they be stopped by air defenses? All
Mhm.
these were questions that nobody had the answer to.
Mhm.
And it was only the test, and various countries experimented with different answers to this question. And it was only the test of war that
Mhm.
clarified some of these questions. The same with mechanized land warfare. Should tank be regarded as an important addition to infantry and artillery in breaking through enemy fronts? Or should they be regarded as an independent force to be employed in deep thrusts into enemy territory? Nobody knew the answer. There were
Mhm.
various theories. There were various views. There
Mhm.
were various compromises, and it's only in hindsight that we have had the question. So this is the main problem. We all
Mhm.
know that that computers, automation, robotics are going to dominate the future, the future, the future of humanity and the future of war.
Mhm.
But how exactly they should be applied? How exactly this should affect the construction of armed forces? Do we still need aircraft carriers? These
Mhm.
huge and very powerful. Nobody has the answer. It's
Mhm.
only through practice that we see some insight. We get some insight into this way. So in Ukraine and also now in the Middle East and so forth. And again, these lessons might be misleading in many ways because of only partial experience, or because of innovations that are going to get in later on, and are going to offset some of the changes that we see. For example, after the Spanish Civil War, in the late 30s, many arrived at the conclusion that large-scale armored formations were not as good as previously thought, because in the context of civil war, they would not play the same role as they would during World War II. But this was a misleading lesson.
Mhm.
So the problem of the concept of prediction is all well as long as you don't apply it to the future.
That's a nice line. So it sounds like, in short,
Not mine. Not mine.
well, then you have to tell us who you're quoting then, if it's not yours.
It's ascribed to what's his name? I forget his name. Never mind. All right. Yeah.
We'll get back to him. So it sounds like Machiavelli had a conceptual problem. Because he had a hard time understanding or imagining progress, he would be skeptical in general of this kind of innovation. Study Caesar, study Hannibal, it's all the same. And it seems like post Renaissance, with the modern period, we accept change, but our problem is we're always asking, okay, like you said, which one of these seeds will grow to be a full oak? So I can say, yeah, look,
Right.
we got a dozen inventors came in this week with their new fandangled super weapon that's going to change the battlefield. I know that 90% of these will fail. How do I know that your magic box or magic tool is the right one? And I seem to recall, yeah, so you're perfectly right. The 20th century with mechanization is fascinating. I seem to recall at some point the British were tinkering with these like heavy fighters. And I think Churchill was in favor of these heavy fighters that had machine guns on the sides, these like very thick glass. And Churchill was of the opinion that basically fighters would never be able to properly aim a gun because the plane's moving too fast. So they need these kind of lateral machine guns, which clearly no one really adopted. It was clearly a but yeah, they start trying to think about which path to go down and what winds up working or not. Um, so I think that that's very helpful to think in terms of um,
Churchill, Churchill still thought at the beginning of World War II, and there is a lot of reference to the fact that he was a young reformist, full of innovative ideas, turning into a conservative in all respects later in life. But by the beginning, at the beginning of World War II, when he was again the First Lord of the Admiralty, he still believed that British battleships could burst into the Baltic, heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, and still survive there, which was obviously, a non-possibility, non-option when we know it in hindsight. So,
mhm,
as he said, the terrible ifs,
mhm. No,
the
well,
terrible ifs are, are
yeah,
gathering.
I see the genius behind the Dardanelles didn't learn. So okay, so I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about things, and I suspect that that will help illuminate this issue about innovation or skepticism. So, how about we talk a little bit about espionage? So, one student was wondering, uh, do you have any kind of overall arcing views about espionage across human history, and in particular, anything in particular to say about, are there any big lessons to be learned about espionage post World War II?
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer. First of all, let's remember that espionage is remains secretive. So if he or she is asking about the ancient times or even later times, it's more difficult to tell. And
Mhm.
also, one has to distinguish between espionage and reconnaissance.
Mm,
Reconnaissance has always been an integral part, since tribal times. Espionage in tribal times could not exist because, you couldn't go into a tribe and pretend to be someone you know, that they know or that they should know. It was, like an extended family. So reconnaissance was always there. Scouts going to find where the enemy's camp was and prepare for it and all that. Espionage, no. During states times, I believe that it was more available to large states and empires with a more developed machinery. We know this from modern times, where the best espionage services were enjoyed first by developed countries with developed bureaucratic uh, uh, diplomatic service. So Venice and Spain and France and England all excelled in the employment of spies, largely supervised by their extensive diplomatic service abroad, also espionage at home. And obviously and then, as I said, the British Empire was very well known for that. And with the United States, once it became a world power, and officially it only became a world power after 1945, obviously, what rudimentary information service it had before World War II turned into the huge empire of the CIA. So once you are a large, the great power, yes, espionage comes into its own much more than otherwise.
Mhm. I suppose I have a kind of quick follow-up on espionage, something that I've been I've thought about, and I really don't know enough about all the facts, but it certainly seems to me that um, espionage at times can depend upon recruiting people who are not just sympathetic for ideological reasons. Okay, there's the Cambridge Five. They do it out of communist sympathies. Maybe it's easy to be a communist if you live in Cambridge and you live a Western lifestyle outside of the Gulag system. But it seems like sometimes espionage also draws on things.
Fortunately, some of them ended up in Moscow and could enjoy the benefits of
Yes.
life in a communist country themselves.
Yeah, yes, they got
Personally,
what they asked for. Uh,
yeah.
but sometimes it seems like they're also drawing on ethno and national ties. It seems like relatively regularly when a spy is caught in the United States who's spying for China, it's either cold hard cash or a lot of them seem to have ties to China. Um, and I'm wondering, is this an advantage for, larger diverse states where they have within them domestically populations that they can try to find as a fit, right? You mentioned that in ancient tribes you couldn't plausibly pass off as someone else. I'm not sure how easy it is for Nigeria to get, try to pass off one of their own in Moscow. So I was wondering if this is this been a bigger trend than maybe people expect, or is it just look, spy services find whatever levers they can, money, debts,
So yeah,
cheating.
so ideology, money, the ethnicity, all of them plays a role. You are familiar with the joke about the perfect CIA spy,
This is the one that
since you
goes to Moscow. Yeah, 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 I am. Yeah,
yeah. So parachuted there, and the first grandmother that he meets asks if he's not in the CIA
yeah,
spy, and he asks, "How did you know?" So he said, there are not many black Russians."
yeah.
Yeah, so it's also a joke against political correctness. Um, but yeah, so take Israel for example. Israel had immigrants coming from Arab countries, so it's not that it's not like somebody with yeah, Chinese origins out spying for the for China. But they had the qualification in terms of the language, the culture, and all that
Mhm.
to go to Arab countries and serve there as agents. And there are some famous cases, there are less so. Yeah, so all of them played a role: money,
Mhm.
ideology, ethnicity, everything. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, okay. I was just.
The feelings of being unrewarded in their native country.
Mm.
Uh, all of these have played a role.
Yes, wasn't that the excuse for Benedict Arnold going over to the British? Was he felt he was
Yeah, yeah.
insufficiently rewarded by the Americans? Yes. Um, a final student question. This is a very it's a big question, but I think it's an interesting one. So the idea is that
All right.
basically prior to the emergence of states like Egypt and Mesopotamia, or the states in Egypt and Mesopotamia, would we think that violence was primarily or greatly driven by belief systems or religions? And if this was with resource scarcity, the kind of two main reasons for violent competition. So I guess the idea is something like, would religion be in a way, I guess with material scarcity, one of the kind of primary or most primitive drivers of violence?
So the question is about pre-state societies, right? Tribal
Hmm.
societies,
Yeah,
hunter-gatherers, and all
yeah.
that. The answer is basically a resounding, well, almost a resounding no. In all the well-recorded case studies that we have, and again, Australia is by far the supreme one, but also other places in Amazonia, in Highland, New Guinea, and all these. It doesn't play a role. You cannot say that it plays a role. It plays a role. Religion plays a role in terms of purification, rituals after killing, taking all the necessary ritual before going out for war. But the glory of the gods or the missionary aims, all of them are entirely absent in tribal and pre-state society.
Okay, right. So we'll find religion on the periphery, like you said, various ceremonies or rituals that accompany things like the taking of life or the burying, but it's not a cause. It's not a driver. It's not what, and it's not the casus belli. Um,
Correct.
okay. That's it. Okay. I think that's quite interesting. It's certainly very interesting for those who sometimes take a very dim view that religion is this kind of perpetual force for evil throughout human history.
I,
Uh,
I'm skeptical about that.
so am I. So am
That
I.
yeah. No, I concur. That was my point.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's quite helpful. So I had questions of my own, but I feel like recent news and development might need to take precedent over some of my pre-written questions. So I think, look, it's currently for me, it's the end of the 25th of October. For you, it's already the 26th. Things have just happened. Would you want to perhaps comment a little bit on that?
So there was tonight, my time, the Israeli air offensive against Iran in retaliation for the 200 missiles shot against Israel by Iran some 3 weeks ago, and then earlier in April, some thousand munitions of various sorts again fired from Iran into Israel. And Israel retaliated by a very targeted, precise air offensive. The details are still not revealed, but it's clear that the targets were military targets, mainly factories producing missiles, the missile sites, and the air defense system that protects them. And one can assume that the targeting was very precise and effective. But the whole move was intended in order to reestablish deterrence against Iran, so that it doesn't launch missiles against Israel. A first for Iran and then a first for Israel, with the threat held in check that the next time it will be the Iranian oil industry. And Israel is quite capable of paralyzing the entire Iranian oil industry. It avoided doing so this time, partly under American pressure. But it will strike the oil industry almost for sure if Iran shoots back. At the moment, it's a bit silly to predict when things may develop any day now. But I think that there is this tendency in Iran to play down.
Hmm.
And here all sides collaborate in a way in playing down the results of the strike. Israel is not going, I assume, to boast too much about what it destroyed. Iran has already denied that any serious damage has been caused, and this would allow Iran to save face and discontinue a contest that it is probably bound to lose, because
Mhm.
it has nothing like the accuracy and efficacy of the Israeli Air Force.
So, so it sounds like, in a way, what Israel's doing would fit kind of classic view of someone like Suarez. So Suarez, when he talks about, and I'm not saying it's anticipatory war, I'm not saying that, but he talks about, when he is talking about anticipatory war, he talks about this idea of having both a backward-looking and a forward-looking aspect. So in this case, Israel's responding to two previous strikes by Iran, not particularly successful, but at least very clear in the intention and the number of munitions. So this fall and last spring, so Israel's been struck twice. There's a sense of saying we're responding to what you've done in the past. And the deterrence, of course, is the forward-looking aspect of saying, look what we've done, we can do it again, and we can do far worse. What you're doing will not go without a response. And part of what you're saying here, which is interesting, is that there's this kind of bit of political theater where neither side actually maybe feels it's entirely in their interest to give a totally accurate presentation of the facts. In a way, because it's a concession, I guess, to human psychology. That are what's rational to do is what's rational given the kind of creatures we are. And so, if we humiliate the Iranians, then there's this idea that, well, they'll have to fight back. They can't suffer that. You can't be that kind of regime and be humiliated. So you want to say that, oh, the Israelis, or what is that ridiculous phrase they use? Zionist entity or something ridiculous, as if it's not really a country. They come up with some weird. It's like what was it? The Khmer who didn't want to officially have a name. So they say, okay, look, we've struck them, but like they missed, and it's just a joke. And look, we're still standing strong. That allows them to back down without looking like they back down. And the Israelis can satisfy themselves with not needing further strikes if they don't make the humiliation too clear. I suppose in a way this is like what was it? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a whole trade-off of removing missiles in Cuba so that there are missiles taken away. Where were they? Missiles in Turkey, I think, or something like that. But the deal was largely secret, right? And the idea was
There
that, yeah.
was, there was another commitment that the United States would not invade Cuba.
Hmm.
Take
Right.
this commitment. Also kept secret. Yeah.
Hmm. Right. So this idea that which you might think is relates back to this point about espionage, spying and diplomacy is less visible than a siege. So we don't always get all the details or not right away. So yes, I suppose this is also maybe a reason to worry about the way in which certain thinkers seem to expect a lot out of ordinary citizens and soldiers when trying to judge world affairs. And you might say, well, look at this. This is a pretty simple case where there's an attempt to kind of mask and diminish and in some way distort what you could call objective reality, and as it filters through to the citizens or the service members of these states. And so you might wonder how realistic it is that some of these philosophers or political theorists think that ordinary citizens and soldiers should be in the business of judging, second guessing their governments all the time. You can probably guess I don't think it's a brilliant idea. Um, so so at this point, maybe you have some thoughts about the kind of what has happened so far in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, which is a more recent development than in Gaza. So perhaps you have some thoughts or commentary on what's been happening with Israel versus Hezbollah.
So obviously, the damage inflicted on Hezbollah has gone far beyond not only the expectation of Hezbollah and Iran, but also I would think of the expectations of most Israelis, me included, uh, extremely effective strike, meeting the most optimistic. I mean, even those familiar have with inside within the defense community, with inside knowledge about the capabilities, all were pleasantly surprised by the scale of success in decimating Hamas, destroying his entire command echelon, destroying a lot of its missiles. Now Israel is has for a week or two has already been engaged in also in ground operation intended mainly to destroy the huge military infrastructure that Hamas has built on the border with Israel in anticipation of the kind of invasion that was, they kidnapped from Hamas, from Hezbollah by Hamas on October 7th. But had Hezbollah been able to carry it out, it would have been the 10 times more dangerous and more effective. So this, in a way, has had the effect of recovering some of much of the credibility of Israeli intelligence, and that was tarnished by the terrible events of October 7th last year, on the Gaza border. How this is going to end in Lebanon is anybody's guess. Hezbollah cannot agree to any settlement, cannot agree, despite all the rhetoric and then the formal position by the United States. Cannot agree to not return to the south of Lebanon, and so I guess that unfortunately, the main card here on both sides is the refugees. That is, there are now more than 1 million refugees, mostly from the south of Lebanon, that had to evacuate their villages, and in the south of Lebanon, also in the Shiite neighborhood of Beirut, also in the Bekaa, in the north of Lebanon. They were warned by the Israelis to vacate their places of residence where Hezbollah took root and positioned its missiles and other infrastructure. And Israel has 60,000 refugees for more than a year from its northern borders. So I guess that the pressure from these refugees on Hezbollah, most of them are Shia. That is its domestic domestic base, would hopefully would bring about some informal ceasefire sometime in the future. Hopefully not in the too long distance, and after Israel finishes its work along the border that is destroying the rest of the infrastructure there. And thereafter, Israel would simply, that there would be, the conditions for the return of refugees from both sides. And after that, Israel will take active action to prevent Hezbollah from returning to the south of Lebanon, because, again, no international force will do the job. Nobody, to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain, nobody is going to die for the south of Lebanon. He meant Prague, obviously. Other than Israel, which is directly Yeah, this is more or less the situation as I see it, but it's fluid.
So it seems like part of what you're saying. So on the one hand, we get unexpected results. War is full of uncertainty, and you get the kind of maximally hopeful scenario plays out. It's very rare, but you get it. I remember telling someone that if you saw it in a Hollywood movie, you think it's James Bond stuff, where the pagers work and then they go default from the pagers to the walkie-talkies, and the walkie-talkies work, and then you knock out their top
Yes.
leaders. It just sounds like it just sounds too good to be true. So
Yeah.
that's a rare thing, but they happen. Rare things happen. People win the lottery. In this case, it's the IDF. But here it also seems like something interesting. I was just talking in class to my students about um, we were talking about irregulars, and we're talking about prisoners of war and guerrillas. And Walzer was talking about how there's this relationship between guerrillas who claim to act in the name of population, whether that's true or not, can always be verified in a way. But it seems like if part of your argument is that you're doing this, excuse me, for these people, you're their protectors, you're their shield. Then this is the problem: is that if what they're doing is creating these insufferable conditions for these Shiites, then Hezbollah, in a way, is stuck, right? If their very claim to exist is to protect them, and now they're putting them in a situation which is just intolerable, then in a way, it seems like, well, either Hezbollah, basically abandons its so-called mandate, and then just, you know, turns out to be not the group that maybe many Shiites either hope or believe it is, or they want to protect that image in order to maintain that base of support and that sympathy, and that limits their range of action, right?
Hezbollah is much more attuned to the suffering of the Shia population than Hamas
Okay.
is sensitive to the misery of the civilian population in Gaza.
That's is a I never thought about that. Could you tell us why? Why would there be that difference?
Uh, because I guess because Hamas is a jihadist group, as Hezbollah is much more rooted in internal Lebanese politics, in its community, which is one of four ethnic communities composing Lebanon. The surprising as this may sound, uh, Hamas mission is in a way more universal. Obviously, with
Hmm.
Hezbollah and Iran also, they have this universal message to be sure. But it's more rooted in Iranian national interest, and in the same way, it's also more rooted in the Shia national interest within Lebanon.
Okay, so it sounds to me like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I recall reading that someone was explaining that, look, the Taliban are not just these rootless jihadists like ISIS wanted to be. It's a Pashtun Islamist movement. It's deeply rooted in Afghan culture and territory. It's why it doesn't export, right? Talibans don't export. It's an Afghan movement. In a way, it's far more rooted and responsive, at least to the dominant ethnic that produces it. And so it sounds like Hezbollah and the Taliban are in that way more similar. And you might say, in a way, Hamas might share certain points with ISIS that, claims this universal mantle, or claims to be less beholden to a particular people or place.
Somewhere in the middle, it would seem that Sinwar, the deceased leader, took them in that direction because traditionally Hamas also was more wedded into Palestinian politics.
Hmm.
Sinwar had this jihadist messianic vision of more strongly imprinted on Hamas and on its policies.
Well, he's now at leisure to explore that messianic vision.
Absolutely.
His schedule has freed up suddenly. less day-to-day labor on that front. All right. Well, look, we're coming up on an hour, and I don't want to abuse your time. So I'll just ask one final question, maybe mildly related to something I might be thinking about writing on. The war in Ukraine has been going on for now some time, not quite 3 years. So far as I can tell, things are collapsing pretty quickly for the Ukrainians. And so far as I could tell, some commentators, had thought that this might be a long war, 10 years, frozen conflict. And now it seems like maybe some of those predictions were, because they're about the future, the worst thing to make predictions about, are not coming true anymore. What would you find to be one of the lesson you think is worth meditating about the fighting in Ukraine?
We have been disconnected probably by the Iranians. That's their retaliatory strike. So your last question about Ukraine, no? Ukraine.
Yes, yeah, I was yes, we had suffered a momentary interruption. I'm sure we can cut it in the editing. Um, hide the effects of Iran's secret service. Yes, I was just saying that I remember reading people thinking that the Russian army is going to collapse, the war would last 10 years. My understanding of the last few months of fighting is that it certainly doesn't look like the war will last 10 years or become a frozen conflict. So I was wondering what kind of lesson do you think would be the primary lesson if you had to, if you had to give a lecture on the war in Ukraine, what would be your main takeaway that we were supposed to learn?
So I was saying that it's too broad a question. I cannot answer it in a few minutes. You asked what surprised me about the war.
Sure.
So what surprised me about the war is the Russian abysmal performance. I credited their military with more.
Hmm.
B, the effectiveness of Ukrainian resistance again,
Hmm.
and C, it demonstrated, the ability of the light drones, which, again, if we go back to the first question about military innovation, we all knew about the drones, including light drones and the potential and everything, and it's their effectiveness in the war has surprised at least me, or
Hmm.
I guess not only me.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, otherwise the significance of the war, you can discuss it from many angles. And I must say that I don't know how long it's going to last. And I remind us all that within 2 weeks we are going to have elections in the United States that may affect the question of how long the war in Ukraine is going to last. Frozen conflicts certainly looks like a very feasible scenario. I don't know.
Hmm. Well, that's already a lot, and I think that you're quite right that I think particularly the light drones and these big, massive Reaper type drones that we saw a lot of it in Ukraine. And I also think it helps, for my part, one thing I thought was interesting is it helped get rid of some of these silly myths that emerged out of Afghanistan and Iraq that somehow drone operators were, immune or playing video games. And it's like, well, that's just because they were Americans fighting a poor country. Now, if the drones are in relative proximity in countries, then drone operators get killed all the time. So I think that there was a kind of silly view that, war was more remote and video game like for unnecessary reasons in the war of Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we see that, yeah, drone operators are like artillerymen. They might be more removed from combat, but they can get killed too. Um,
The battlefield remains a dangerous place.
yes. Well, sometimes you'll need reminded of basic truths. It's amazing how much
Absolutely.
educated people have to be reminded of basic
That
truths.
you need a lifetime of studying war to reach this conclusion.
All right. Well, Azar, it's been a pleasure once again. I think you've given our students and students at heart quite a bit to think about. And so thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope we'll have the chance to talk again soon.
Thank you for having me.